Okay, so let's recap here. See what I did there? Swivel is the parent company of Recap. The main revenue for Swivel was the sale of the Swivel robot and subscriptions to the cloud-based services that it worked with. Recap was a product developed by Swivel. It was free for all users and didn't generate any revenue. So the development of Recap was somewhat dependent on the financial stability of Swivel. But around this time in 2016, Brian explains how a period of financial struggles drastically impacted Recap.
In the fall of 2016, Swivel's business had a bit of a blip, I would call it, in terms of our stability and revenues. And we ended up having to pull back on our investment in Recap and go through a layoff, which is a difficult point in time for companies. So it's very, very painful. What ensued for us was 6 months of needing to step back and rebuild our foundations, add back to the team.
Along with the financial issues that Brian just laid out, there was another challenge that Swivel would be faced with during this time. Several years before Swivel started developing Recap, there was another startup out of Minnesota that began working on a similar product. And by 2017, that platform was starting to catch fire. Dr. Charlie Miller and Bradford Hozak had developed a video response platform called Flipgrid at the University of Minnesota. Flipgrid and Recap essentially did the same thing. In early 2015, Flipgrid was able to secure nearly $17 million in funding in just 17 days. This capital provided the company with the resources and the people to continually refine and improve their platform. Flipgrid was also wildly successful at building a huge community of educators who were excited to share how they use the platform on social media. The result was massive organic growth. It was clear that in 2016 and 2017, teachers all around the world had caught Flipgrid fever, a phrase which was coined on social media and then adopted as a marketing slogan by the company.
I would say the winter of 2016, 2017, into the spring of 2017 is when their community really started to explode, because this was already at a point in time where Flipgrid had raised this massive venture round of $17 million, which also has a lot to do with why they were able to build this large community movement.
Brian's statement about the growth of Flipgrid is no exaggeration. In fall of 2016, Flipgrid announced a 450% year-over-year growth in new teacher accounts. They had eclipsed this record months later in January of 2017, announcing an 800% year-over-year growth. This type of quick success in a short period of time is not very typical in EdTech, and that's what makes what Flipgrid did during this time so impressive. And as a result, Recap was faced with not only trying to fend off some internal financial issues, but also had the challenge of trying to build a community around student voice at a time when Flipgrid was dominating the conversation.
So what ended up happening was oftentimes their community would I'll try to describe it nicely, but kind of override our community. We would try to hold Twitter chats, but most often it would turn into a Flipgrid fan coming in and talking about Flipgrid and trying to recruit our users over for. There's lots of kind of new ideas and applications we've contributed in our either from our community or just kind of thought leadership on the application of Recap. And it was very often the case that those would get co-opted by the Flipgrid community, but not noted the origin of those things. And I'm describing kind of the basics of it, but if you multiply that by 10,000 people talking very loudly, it gets very difficult to build your own community and some positivity about what you're doing.
The financial issues and Flipgrid fever had limited some of the plans that Brian had for Recap. As a result, the Swivel team did try to add some new features with the Recap 2.0 launch, incorporating the idea of inquiry and questioning through Recap journeys. This was slightly different from the original version of Recap. Teachers like Rochelle found a lot of value in Recap journeys.
You could still ask questions like you had been with the video response, but the difference is that you could create a question for the students and then it could kind of lead them onto their own direction or path and to go through and explore with different websites or things, different steps in the process. It focused more on the curiosity piece and like the inquiry-based student-driven learning and gave them kind of this like catalyst to maybe look and explore more on something they were interested in, and it let them kind of work through it in a more natural progression, like, oh, well, I found this now, this is interesting, oh, well, look at this thing, and move on to that different direction.
But while educators likely appreciated the idea behind journeys, many still used Recap as they always have, a simple way to assess student learning through video prompts. While the intentions here were good, Brian considers the whole Recap Journeys experience a bit of a misstep.
We tried to elevate the value of that product to involve some more instructional aspects with some formulas we had based on research about how you ignite students' curiosity. I would say those features and those initiatives were less successful, and most often people return to using Recap for that core value that we even started off with.
Internally, it was tough for Recap to compete against the momentum that Flipgrid was building, and Brian and the Swivel team saw this manifest in different ways.
It's just the feeling that that what ideas we have aren't working, or generally speaking, even when you work in a startup, you need positive user feedback and encouragement to feel like you're onto something and that you have enthusiasm to come in every day and have passion for what you do. And when you don't have that, or it feels like somebody else is beating you so badly, it's just very difficult to stay positive. And so it did lead to some turnover in the organization as a result of that, just because it was a challenging experience to be on this end of that.
With Recap struggling, Brian looked into several different possibilities.
We went out and explored how to spin Recap out into its own company to better compete with Flipgrid. And so we went out and tested the idea of raising money, but had a lot of negativity around the idea of just charging a subscription model for what we do. And so the investors we spoke to said, I don't believe you'll ever make a lot of money doing that. And unless you find a different model, I wouldn't invest in this. So the idea of Recap 2.0 was actually in response to all of the feedback we had gotten to try to start to move in a direction of a different kind of business model.
So in 2017, there were a lot of questions for Swivel to consider. Should they stay the course with Recap, keep plugging along to serve the smaller but loyal community that they had built over the past few years? Or was it time to cut their losses and move on, pivot, or maybe swivel, and move into a different direction? The entire Recap team definitely had a lot to think about. 6 a.m., June 18th, 2018. On this day, thousands of educators would open their Twitter feed to find Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella announced that his company, Microsoft, had purchased Flipgrid. The leading platform for promoting student voice through video now had the backing of one of the largest and most well-known technology companies in the world. Competing against Flipgrid was overwhelming already, and now it was about to get harder, but it never really got to that point. Shortly before this announcement, Brian and Swivel made the decision to move on from Recap. On October 8th, 2018, Brian formally announced the news to the world. Recap was shutting down.
In the fall of 2017, it was already becoming pretty evident to us that we were not going to be able to catch up. The community, just following Twitter followings alone on Flipgrid, they went from something like 7,000 followers in March of 2017 to 25,000 or something like that in the fall. And that kind of user growth within followings on Twitter is pretty massive, right? And we didn't feel like we could compete directly with them. Flipgrid made such a leap ahead, it was something that we weren't able to keep up with at that point in time. And so, there are influences of kind of the business behind what we were doing that impacted what we could deliver to people and why we were going in those directions. And we just weren't able to kind of bring them all to fruition in a clean enough package.
Here's what Rochelle remembers about that news.
I felt really bad because a lot of teachers were used to using that, and I really enjoyed the connections with the team. But based on what I know about Flipgrid and connecting with Microsoft and just that's hard. Like something like that's hard to compete with. But yeah, I was kind of like, oh, really?
In a blog post titled "Recap is Shutting Down," Brian shared some of the reasons behind his decision.
Through an analysis and research, we just decided that for us to have a more positive path and a path that we could handle moving in a new direction with what we had was best.
He openly admitted that Recap 2.0 was a mistake that they could never quite rectify. He also admitted to being completely overwhelmed by the momentum that Flipgrid had built.
So I think in a vacuum, we probably could have continued to reinvest in that product. At the same time, though, that we had that misstep, it coincided with Flipgrid's very massive successes and growth. And those two things together kind of conspired against us being able to resurrect a positive path for Recap. And I think it takes a sophisticated person to understand why, and maybe even some time to understand why things were so different in terms of their community and in terms of ours. They got a few things better than us, and I think they, from all reports, it's a good product and people find value in it. So they earned that positivity. But in terms of our experience, it was something that made it very difficult to persist. And I think it's the last thing I'd say it's worth recognizing is I think the Flipgrid community was a bit of a once in a decade kind of movement. Mm-hmm. And so we just happened to be on the wrong side of what ended up being an incredibly large wave of enthusiasm in the opposite direction.
And just like that, Recap, a platform that seemed so promising 2 years earlier, was finished. But the story, it doesn't end here with the closing of Recap. Because while the Swivel team couldn't resurrect that positive path, they were able to take what did work with Recap and spin it off into a new venture. Around 2018, they mounted the beginning of their comeback. And you'll find out about this comeback coming up next.